All right. I'm coming. I'm coming. Here we are. Here we are. Don't give up on me. There we go. Okay. I was just out getting a lens cleaner for these cheaters I've got to wear for this book. If you haven't watched earlier readings from this book, you know, generally speaking, I don't need to wear cheaters to read. But this one, the type is so small, I had to break these out. My arms are getting shorter every year, it seems. Someday I will have to break down and actually go to the doctor and get my eyes checked. And I will inevitably be wearing some glasses. But that is okay. Uh, so, thank you all for coming in. Yeah, that looks pretty good. All right. Keep them low so I can see over the top of them for the moment. All right, so this, I think I looked last time, and this is going to be a fairly long chapter. No, most of them have been around 30-ish pages. This one's like 50, so I will most definitely have to take a break. I'll try to do that about halfway through, um, but I know my throat's going to be screaming at me by the time we get done with this one. Um, so, anyway, let's just jump right on into it. So we're on chapter 8, The Continuing Contradiction of Slavery, a comparison of British America and Latin America. Let me make sure. Is my sound working good? Yeah, okay. Okay. Was anti-slavery then a direct outgrowth of slavery itself? We have maintained that the concept of man as a material possession has always led to contradictions in law and custom. In the ancient world, these contradictions did not give rise to abolitionism, but in the historical development of American slavery, there were deep strains that made the institution of a source of dissonance and discontent. Even men whose interests were closely tied to the system expressed occasional misgivings over mounting debts and economic decay and rising proportion of Negroes to whites, the haunting threat of insurrection, the failure to infuse masters and slaves with the spirit of Christian love, and the growing discrepancy between American servitude and the European ideals of liberty. It remains to be asked whether the evolution of colonial laws and customs provided a basis for believing that the worst evils of slavery could be gradually eliminated legislation, through wise legislation, or for concluding that slavery by its very nature was beyond reform. Such a question poses many problems. As a result of differences in economy, social, and political situations, and the ratio of Negroes to whites, the actual status and condition of colonial slaves varied considerably from one region to another. Yet no slave colony had a monopoly on either kindness or cruelty. Slave codes were often enacted with a view to quieting local fears or appeasing a church or government. Travelers were sometimes biased or quick to generalize from a few fleeting impressions. Since we still seriously lack a thorough comparative study of Negro slavery in the various colonies, we must be content with fragmentary evidence and with extremely tentative conclusions. There would seem to be some basis, however, for questioning two assumptions which have been widely accepted by modern historians. The first is that Negro slavery in the British colonies and southern United States was of a nearly uniform severity, the slave being legally deprived of all rights of person, property, and family, and subjected to the will of his owner and the police power of the state, which barred his way to education, free movement, or emancipation. The second assumption is that the French, and especially the Spanish and Portuguese, were far more liberal in their treatment of slaves, whom they considered as human beings who had merely lost a portion of their external freedom. Untainted by racial prejudice and free from the pressures of a fluid, capitalistic economy, these easygoing colonists are supposed to have protected the human rights of the slave and to have facilitated his manumission. Some historians have simply held that slavery in North America was much harsher than that in Latin America, but Stanley M. Elkins has argued more persuasively that the great contrast was not in the bondsman's physical well-being, but in the recognition of his basic humanity. As a methodological device, this distinction has obvious merit, since a master might look upon his slaves as subhuman animals and still provide them with comfortable maintenance. On the other hand, it would be unrealistic to draw too sharp a line between moral status and physical treatment. It is difficult to see how a society could have much respect for the value of slaves as human personalities if it sanctioned their torture and mutilation, the selling of their small children, the unmitigated exploitation of their labor, and the drastic shortening of their lives through overwork and inadequate nourishment. While a few isolated instances of sadistic cruelty, I don't know, that didn't sound right the first time, would reveal little about the legal or moral status of slaves. We should not exclude physical treatment when it is part of a pattern of systemic oppression, which is fully sanctioned by the laws and customs of a society. We shall find, however, that there is other evidence than physical treatment for challenging the assumption that Latin Americans were more sensitive than Anglo Americans to the essential humanity of their slaves. This assumption has important implications for a history of anti-slavery thought. If servitude under the Spanish and Portuguese was generally mild and humane, and if the institution itself tended to promote a gradual achievement of freedom, then we could not be surprised by the fact that anti-slavery agitation began in Britain and British America. The peculiar severities of British colonial slavery would appear to have arisen from local economic or social conditions, and we should have reason to suspect that anti-slavery movements were a direct response to an unprecedented evil. And while the extremes of both slavery and anti-slavery could be explained by the absence of a stable social structure, we could conclude that the Anglo-American reformer might well have looked to Latin America for a rational model. By gradually imposing the institutional protections of Latin American slavery on the formless and unregulated slavery of the North, he might have removed the evils from a necessary system of labor. But if the contrast between slavery in the various American colonies was not so clear-cut as has generally been supposed, we are left with a different set of implications. It would be likely that the appearance of anti-slavery agitation was less a direct response to a unique evil than a result of particular cultural and religious developments in the English-speaking world. And if both the evils of slavery and the attempts to ameliorate them were fairly persuasive throughout the Americas, we should look more skeptically at programs for slow and gradual reform. We should expect to find general emancipation often associated with the revolutions and civil wars, as was the case in Saint Domingue, the United States, and several of the Spanish colonies, or with political upheaval and the fall of a government, as in Brazil. Excuse me. Okay. A word of explanation is in order regarding the chronological range of selected examples and illustrations. If we are to judge the influence of traditional Catholic culture, the crucial period in Latin American slavery is the early colonial era, before the full impact of the Enlightenment, the American and French revolutions, and the wars of independence. But when we test the assumption that slavery in the British colonies and southern United States was of a monolithic character unmitigated by any recognition of the Negro's rights of personality, it is appropriate to select examples from the 19th century when laws and customs had hardened to form a self-contained system of values and precedents. If some of the ameliorative elements we usually associate with Latin American slavery were common in North America, even at a time when bondage had grown more formalized and severe, then we should have less reason to suppose that the basic evils of the institution could have been eliminated by mere palliative reforms. Excuse me, just 1 second. I am going to drive myself nuts if I don't tie my damn shoe. It's sitting here untied, and it will bug me throughout if it hangs there untied. So I know that's a little OCD of me, but I've never claimed I didn't have a little OCD tendency. All right. By the late 18th century, most travelers agreed that in Brazil and the Spanish colonies, the condition of slaves was considerably better than in British America. Any comparison must consider Negro slavery as a system of forced labor, of social organization, and of class and racial discipline. Numerous accounts from the late 18th and 19th centuries tell us that the Latin American slave enjoyed frequent hours of leisure and was seldom subjected to the factory-like regimentation that characterized the capitalistic plantations of the North. They were all capitalistic. Even anyway, I'm not going to get into that. That he faced no legal bars to marriage, education, or eventual freedom, that he was legally protected from cruelty and oppression, and was not stigmatized on account of his race. This relative felicity has quite plausibly been attributed to a culture that de-emphasized the pursuit of private profit, to the Catholic Church's insistence on the slave's right to marry and worship, and to what Gilberto Freire, Freyre, if you know how to pronounce that, let me know, has termed the miscibility of the Portuguese, which submerged sensitivity to racial difference in a frank acceptance of sexual desire. No doubt there is much truth in even the idyllic picture of the Brazilian quote-unquote big house, where slaves and free men pray and loaf together, and where masters shrug their shoulders at account books and prefer to frolic with slave girls in shaded hammocks. But we should not forget that West Indian and North American planters were fond of idealizing their own quote-unquote big houses as patriarchal manners of portraying their Negroes as carefree and indolent, and of proudly displaying humane slave laws which they knew to be unenforceable. Their propaganda, which was supported by travelers' accounts, and which long seemed persuasive to many Northerners and Englishmen, has largely been discredited by numerous critical studies based on a wealth of surviving evidence. Many of the records of Brazilian slavery were destroyed in the 1890s in a fit of abolitionist enthusiasm, and the subject has never received the careful scrutiny it deserves. Only in recent years have such historians as Octavio Ianni, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Jaime Jaramillo Uribe, and C.R. Boxer begun to challenge the stereotyped images of mild servitude and racial harmony. There is little reason to doubt that slavery in Latin America compared with that in North America was less subject to the pressures of competitive capitalism and was closer to a system of patriarchal rights and semi-feudalistic services. But after granting this, we must recognize the inadequacy of thinking in terms of idealized models of patriarchal and capitalistic societies. Presumably, an exploitive capitalistic form of servitude could not exist within a patriarchal society. I'm not so sure about that. The lord of a manor, unlike the entrepreneur who might play the role of lord of a manor, would be incapable of treating men as mere units of labor in a speculative enterprise. But neither would he think of exploring new lands, discovering gold mines, or developing new plantations for the production of sugar and coffee. It is perhaps significant that accounts. Oh, I see what they're saying. So in South America, the slavery was mainly done to maintain a household or a farm that was really more concerned with its own perpetuation and its own producing its own food and etc. Is that I think that's how I'm understanding it. Whereas the plantations in North America were centered on making a profit from a particular crop like cotton or whatever, where they weren't going to be the sole users of that. They were actually growing it specifically to sell. So, okay, I get that. If I'm understanding that correctly, and I think I am. Presumably, an exploitive capitalistic form of servitude could not exist within a patriarchal society. The lord of a manor, unlike the entrepreneur, I know I already read this, but who might play the role of lord of manor would be incapable of treating men as mere units of labor in a speculative enterprise. But neither would he think of exploring new lands, discovering gold mines, or developing new plantations for the production of sugar and coffee. It is perhaps significant that accounts of Latin American slavery often picture the relaxed life on sugar plantations after their decline in economic importance, and ignore conditions that prevailed during the Brazilian sugar boom of the 17th century, the mining boom of the early 18th century, and the coffee boom of the 19th century. Similarly, Southern apologists tended to overlook the human effects of high pressure agriculture in the Southwest and focus their attention on the easygoing and semi patriarchal societies of Tidewater, Maryland, and Virginia. Eugene D. Genovese has recently suggested that while the North American slave system was stimulated and exploited by the capitalist world market, it retained many pre-capitalistic features, such as a lack of innovation, restricted markets, and low productivity of labor, and actually gravitated toward an uneconomical paternalism that was basically antithetical to capitalistic values. Although a particular instance of oppression or well-being can always be dismissed as an exception, it is important to know that range of variation, what range of variation a system permitted. If an exploitive, capitalistic form of servitude was at times common in Brazil and Spanish America, and if North Americans conformed at times to a paternalistic model and openly acknowledged the humanity of their slaves, it may be that differences between slavery in Latin America and the United States were no greater. Actually, he says United States, but the colonies at the time were no greater than regional or temporal differences within the countries themselves. And such a conclusion would lead us to suspect that Negro bondage was a single phenomenon or gestalt whose variations were less significant than underlying patterns of unity. I got to get those things off my eyes when I look away, or it really begins to hurt. Okay. Simon Gray, a Natchez River boatman, provides us with an example of the flexibility of the North American slave system. During the 1850s, most southern states tightened their laws and to all appearances erected an impassable barrier between the worlds of slave and free men. And here, real quick, I just want to see how far into it we are. We started on 223. We're on 230, so we're going to go to um, 2:48 before we stop, so we got a ways to go. But the intent of legislators was, before we take a break, sorry. But the intent of legislators was often offset by powerful forces of economic interest and personality. Simon Gray was an intelligent slave whose superior abilities were recognized by both his master and the lumber company which hired his services. In the 1850s, this lowly slave became the captain of a flatboat on the Mississippi, supervising and paying wages to a crew that included white men. In defiance of law, Gray was permitted to carry firearms, to travel freely on his own, to build and run sawmills, and to conduct commercial transactions as his company's agent. Entrusted with large sums of money for business purposes, Gray also drew a regular salary, rented a house where his family lived in privacy, and took a vacation to Hot Springs, Arkansas, when his health declined. Although there is evidence that in Southern industry and commerce such privileges were not as uncommon as has been assumed, we may be sure that Simon Gray was a very exceptional slave. He might well have been less exceptional in Cuba or Brazil. The essential point, however, is that regardless of restrictive laws, the Southern slave system had room for a few Simon Grays. The flatboat captain could not have acted as he did if the society had demanded a rigorous enforcement of the law. By the time Simon Gray was beginning to enjoy relative freedom, Portugal and Brazil were the only civilized nations that openly resisted attempts to suppress the African slave trade. It has been estimated that by 1853, Britain had paid Portugal some £2,850,965, I assume that's sterling, in bribes, intended to stop a commerce whose horrors had multiplied as a result of efforts to escape detection and capture. But despite British bribes and seizures, the trade continued and was countenanced by the society which has been most praised for its humane treatment of slaves. One of the boats captured by the British in 1842 was a tiny vessel of 18 tons, whose crew consisted of 6 Portuguese. Between decks, in a space only 18 inches high, they had intended to stow 250 African children of about 7 years of age. Suspicion of Britain's motives probably prevented more outspoken attacks on a trade that outraged most of the civilized world. But the fact remains that Brazilian society not only permitted the slave trade to continue for nearly half a century after it had been outlawed by Britain and the United States, but provided a flourishing market for Negroes fresh from Africa. During the 1830s, Brazil imported more than 400,000 slaves. In the single year of 1448, the nation absorbed some 60,000 more. That the reception of these newcomers was not so humane as might be imagined is suggested by a law of 1869, 6 years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which forbade the separate sale of husband and wife, or of children under 15. Not long before, even children under 10 had been separated from their parents and sent to the coffee plantations of the South. So I think that's kind of poorly worded. It almost makes it sound like the Emancipation Proclamation forbade the sale of husband and wife or of children under 15, a separate sale. But I think it's suggested by a law of 1869 which forbade the separate sale of husband and wife or of children under 15. The 6 years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation kind of makes that a fuzzy sentence. Anyway, while I'm already paused, I'll take a drink. These examples are intended only to illustrate the range of variation that could occur in any slave society, and hence the difficulties in preparing the relative severity of slave systems. Barbados and Jamaica were notorious for their harsh laws and regimentation, but occasional proprietors like Josiah Steele or Matthew Lewis succeeded in creating model plantations where Negroes were accorded most of the privileges of white servants. John Stedman, who provided Europe with ghastly pictures of the cruelty of Dutch masters in Suriname, also maintained that humanity and gentleness coexisted with the worst barbarity. The well-being of any group of slaves was subject to many variables. It seems certain that the few Negroes in 18th century Quebec lived a freer and richer life than hundreds of thousands of slaves in 19th century Brazil and Cuba, despite the fact that the latter were technically guarded by certain legal protections, and the former were defined as chattels completely subject to their owner's authority. Islands like Dominica and St. Lucia, which were disorganized by war and a transfer from one nation to another, had few social resources for restraining the unscrupulous master or curbing slave resistance. In the newly developed lands of damn, I don't know why I'm um, in the newly developed lands of captured or ceded colonies such as Berbice, Demerara, Trinidad, and Louisiana, there were few effective checks on the speculative planter bent on reaping maximum profit in the shortest possible time. And whereas the North American slave frequently lived in a land of peace and plentiful food, his West Indian brother was the first to feel the pinch of famine when war cut off essential supplies, or when his master was burdened by debt and declining profits. On the small tobacco farms of colonial Virginia and Maryland, the physical condition of slaves was surely better than in the mines of Minas Gerais, Grais, sorry, or on the great plantations of Bahia, where a Capuchin missionary was told in 1682 that a Negro who endured for 7 years was considered to have lived very long. North American planters were fond of comparing the fertility of their own slaves with the high mortality and low birth rate of those in the West Indies and Latin America, and of concluding that theirs was the milder and more humane system. Such reasoning failed to take account of the low proportion of female slaves in the West Indies, the communicable diseases transmitted by the African trade, and the high incidence of tetanus and other maladies that were particularly lethal to infants in the Caribbean. No doubt differences in sanitation and nutrition, rather than in physical treatment, explain the fact that while Brazil and the United States each entered the 19th century with about 1 million slaves, and subsequent importations into Brazil were 3 times greater than those into the United States, by the Civil War there were nearly 4 million slaves in the United States and only 1.5 million in Brazil. Now, see, that contradicts some stuff that's come around since this book. Remember, this book was written in 1966, and it won and the author won the Pulitzer Prize in '67 for this book. But since then, they've said that in between the Caribbean and well, Brazil mostly, but South America, there were something like 11 million slaves. And they said that only about 400,000 slaves were ever actually brought directly from Africa to North America, or, well, what would become the United States, the 13 colonies. Um, so that contradicts some newer information. But anyway, just an aside. But after all such allowances are made, it still seems probable that planters in Brazil and the West Indies, who were totally dependent on fresh supplies of labor from Africa, were less sensitive than North Americans to the value of human life. When a slave's life expectancy was a few years at most, and when each slave could easily be replaced, there was little incentive to improve conditions or limit hours of work. According to both C.R. Boxer and Celso Furtado, Brazilian sugar planters took a short-term view of their labor needs and accepted the axiom which spread to the British Caribbean, that it was good economy to work one's slaves to death and then purchase more. In colonial Brazil, Jesuit priests felt it necessary to admonish overseers not to kick pregnant women in the stomach or beat them with clubs, since this brought a considerable loss in slave property. But what of the benevolent laws of Latin America which allowed a slave to marry, to seek relief from a cruel master, and even to purchase his own freedom? It must be confessed that on this crucial subject historians have been overly quick to believe that what travelers passed on from conversations with slaveholders, and to make glowing generalizations on the basis of one-sided evidence. Much has been made of the fact that the Spanish model law, Las Siete Partidas, recognized freedom as man's natural state and granted the slave certain legal protections. But the argument loses some of its point when we learn that the same principles were accepted in North American law, and that Las Siete Partidas not only made the person and possessions of the bondsman totally subject to his master's will, but even gave owners the right to kill their slaves in certain circumstances. Some of the early Spanish and Portuguese legislation protecting Indians has erroneously been thought to have extended to Negroes as well. In actuality, the first laws pertaining to Negroes in such colonies as Chile, Panama, and New Granada were designed to prohibit them from carrying arms, from moving about at night, and above all from fraternizing with Indians. It is true that in the late 17th and early 18th centuries the Portuguese crown issued edicts intended to prevent the gross mistreatment of Negro slaves. But as C.R. Boxer has pointed out, Brazilian law was a chaotic tangle of Manueline and Philippine codes, entrusted by numerous decrees which often contradicted one another, and which were interpreted by lawyers and magistrates notorious for their dishonesty. Even if this had not been true, slaves were dispersed over immense areas where there were few towns, and where justice was administered by local magistrates whose power lay in land and slaves. It is not surprising that in one of the few recorded cases of the Portuguese crown interfering to investigate the torture of a slave, nothing was done to the accused owner. This revisionist view receives support from Jaime Jaramillo Uribe's conclusion that the judicial, I know I'm butchering that name, that the judicial system of New Granada was so ineffective that even the reform legislation of the late 18th century did little to change the oppressive life of Negro slaves. In theory, of course, the Portuguese or Spanish slave possessed an immortal soul that entitled him to respect as a human personality, but though perfunctorily baptized in Angola or on the Guinea coast, he was appraised and sold like any merchandise upon his arrival in America. Often slaves were herded en masse, stark naked, into large warehouses where they were examined and marketed like animals. As late as the mid-19th century, the spread of disease among newly arrived Negroes who were crowded into the warehouses of Rio de Janeiro brought widespread fears of epidemic. The Spanish, who ordinarily sold horses and cows individually, purchased Negroes in lots, or piezas de Indias, which were sorted according to age and size. There is abundant evidence that Brazilians were little troubled by the separation of Negro families. In the 1850s, coffee planters in the rich Paraíba Valley thought nothing of selling their own illegitimate children to passing traders. Despite protests from priests and governors, it was also common practice for Brazilians to purchase attractive girls who could profitably be let out as prostitutes. In Brazil, as in other slave societies, there were apparently authentic reports of bondsmen being boiled alive, roasted in furnaces, or subjected to other fiendish punishments. More significant than such extreme cases of sadism is the evidence that planters who were successful and were accepted as social leaders equipped their estates with the chambers and instruments of torture, that it was a common custom to punish a recalcitrant slave with novenas, which meant that he could be tied down and flogged for 9 to 13 consecutive nights, his cuts sometimes being teased with a razor and rubbed with salt and urine. In the mid-18th century, Manuel Ribeiro Roca attached the Brazilian rural theology attacked the Brazilian quote-unquote rural theology, which allowed masters to welcome their new slaves with a vicious whipping, to work them in the fields without rest, and to inflict 100 or more lashes without cause. A century later, planters in the Paraíba Valley taught their sons that Negroes were not true men, but inferior beings who could only be controlled by continued punishment, and some of the clergy maintained that Africans were the condemned sons of Cain. This widespread conviction of racial inferiority justified a regime of hatred and brutality in which the slave had no right of appeal, and even fatal beatings went unpunished. Obviously, such much depended on regional differences in economy and social tradition. The recent studies of the extreme southern provinces of Brazil by Octavio Ianni and Fernando Cardoso reveal a picture of harsh chattel slavery and racial prejudice which stands in marked contrast to the familiar images of benign servitude in the North. During the last third of the 18th century, the southern states developed a capitalistic economy which was initially stimulated by the export of wheat, but which came to rely heavily on the production of jerked beef. Whether engaged in agriculture, stock raising, or the processing of meat or leather, the slaveholding capitalists were bent on maximizing production for commercial profit. Because the economy rested on slave labor, and because physical labor was largely associated with the African race, Negroes and mulattoes were regarded as mere instruments of production, wholly lacking in human personality. According to Ianni, the slave was a totally alienated being, able to express himself only through the intermediary of his owner. He was under the complete dominion of a master class, which rigidly controlled his movements and held power over his life and death. Though kind and paternalistic masters were to be found in Paraná, Santa Catarina, and Rio Grande do Sul, as elsewhere in the Americas, the overriding fact is that the ideology and judicial framework of southern Brazil were geared to the maintenance of an exploitive system of labor, to the preservation of public security, and to the perpetuation of power in the hands of a white ruling caste. At every point, the Negro was forced to shape his behavior in accordance with the actions and expectations of the white man. And remember, these white men are Portuguese. Just wanted to point that out. Conditions were undoubtedly better in the cities, where protective laws were more often enforced and where Negroes had at least a chance of acquiring money that could purchase freedom. But in colonial Cartagena, Negro slaves were subject to the most repressive police regulations and to punishments which ranged from death to the cutting off of hands, ears, or the penis. In Mariana, the city councilors demanded in 1755 that the right to purchase freedom be withdrawn and that slaves who tried to escape be crippled for life. While both proposals aroused the indignation of the viceroy at Bahia, they indicate the state of mind of a master class which, in Minas Gerais, posted the heads of fugitive slaves along the roadsides, and men who accepted such brutality as a necessary part of life could not always be expected to abandon their fields or shut down their sugar mills on 35 religious holidays, in addition to 52 Sundays. It was not an idyllic semi-feudal servitude that made colonial Brazil widely known as the hell for Negroes, and as a place where their lives could be nasty, brutish, and short, or that drove countless bondsmen to suicide or revolt, and reduced others to a state of psychic shock, of flat apathy and depression, which was common even in Brazil to acquire the special name of banzo. Okay. Drink. In the second half of the 18th century, Spain and Portugal, like Britain and France, became intensely concerned with the reform of imperial administration. Several losses in the Seven Years' War forced Spain to re-examine her colonial policy and to consider the best means for increasing the labor force, especially in Cuba. Ideas derived in part from the French Enlightenment encouraged statesmen to centralize administration, draft vast systems. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble tonight. Like, weird. Um, Ideas derived in part from the French Enlightenment encouraged statesmen to centralize administration, draft vast systems of law, and experiment with plans for social and economic progress. In Portugal, the Marquis de Pombal initiated colonial reforms that included a tightening of administration and the enactment of laws for the protection of slaves and the greater equalization of races. It is important to note, however, that Pombal's legislation affirming the civil rights of Indian and Asiatic subjects did not, in the words of C.R. Boxer, extend, quote, in anything like the same measure to the persons of Negro blood, end quote. And even in Asia there was such racial prejudice against the Portuguese that colonists long resisted the decrees, though they dreaded Pombal's dictatorial methods and usually carried out his orders without delay. Inspired by French ideals and administrative techniques, Charles III of Spain also supported a series of enlightened reforms that were intended to increase the force of reason and humanity in the Spanish Empire. Since Spain intended to stock Cuba with prodigious numbers of new slaves, and since the existing laws were a confused patchwork of ancient statutes and ordinances, it was obviously essential to follow the example of Colbert, and construct a code that would ensure a profitable use of labor without wholly subverting the cardinal precepts of religion and morality. Because the Real Cedula, I again butchering it, was drafted in 1789 and bore the influence of the Enlightenment as well as Spanish Catholic tradition, it was an improvement over the Code Noir of 1685. Most notably, it included provisions for registering and keeping records of slaves and machinery for securing information and punishing masters who denied their slaves adequate food or religious instruction. In 1784, a royal edict had also prohibited the branding of slaves, a protection which had been given to Indians long before. But in spite of laws and traditions in the Spanish colonies that permitted slaves to buy their own freedom, the Real uh, Cedula, I guess, was silent on the subject of manumission. And it not only ruled that every slave was to work from dawn to dusk, but made clear that his employment should be confined to agriculture alone. There are many indications, moreover, that Spanish planters paid little attention to the law. Certainly, the Negro slaves who revolted in Venezuela in 1795 did not think their grievances could be expressed through appeals to kindly priests and judges. Without minimizing the importance of the Real Cedula, I'll say Cedula, as an advance in humane legislation, one may observe that by 1789 there were far more enlightened proposals being discussed in Britain, France, and the United States, and that even British and American slaveholders were suggesting reforms that went beyond the Spanish law. We still doing good on sound? Yeah, okay. Furthermore, to round out one's picture of Spanish attitudes toward slavery, it is well to look at other colonial slave codes, such as the one written for Santo Domingo in 1785, which claimed to be in accordance with a recent royal ordinance. The chief purposes of this detailed code were to reinvigorate a declining economy, to prevent insurrection, to put an end to the growing idleness, pride, and thievery of Negroes, and to preserve a clear-cut division between the white race and las casas infirmas. Since slaves were regarded as indispensable instruments for the public welfare, their owners were obliged to provide adequate food and clothing. Yet slaves were incapable of acting in their own behalf in court, and could acquire no property except for the benefit and by the permission of their masters. All Negroes, whether slave or free, were barred from public and religious elementary schools. Their movements and employments were placed under the strictest regulations. They were required at all times to be submissive and respectful to all white persons, and to treat each one like a master. Any Negro or mulatto who contradicted a white man, or who spoke in a loud or haughty voice, was to be severely whipped. The penalties increased for raising a hand against a white person, but diminished in accordance with the lightness of the offender's skin. The stigma of Slavish origin extended even to occupation and dress. Negroes were not to deprive white men of jobs by working in artisan trades, nor were they to wear fine clothes, gold, or precious jewels. There is evidence that beginning in the late 18th century, Negro bondage became milder and better regulated in certain parts of Latin America. In such areas as New Granada, the very survival of the institution was jeopardized by the revolutionary example of Saint Domingue. The outbreak of rebellions and continuing raids by fugitive Cimarrons, the uncertainty of the African trade in the face of war and British humanitarianism, and the unsettling effects of war on markets and credit. Wow. The tumultuous period from the French Revolution to the Spanish-American Wars was wars for independence brought abrupt changes in economic and political interests which often favored the Negro slave. But even Cuba, which had a long tradition of encouraging manumissions, was the scene of gross cruelty and heavy slave mortality, through much of the 19th century, and critics of the regime, like the former Jose Antonio Seco, were either silenced or banished from the island. In 1823, when the British government pledged itself to the amelioration and eventual eradication of colonial slavery, Jose Bonifacio de Andrada hoped to persuade his fellow Brazilians that the success of their independence and new constitution depended on making a similar commitment. Although Portugal he charged was guilty of the initial sin, quote, "We tyrannize over our slaves and reduce them to the state of brutish animals, and they in return initiate us in their immorality and teach us all their vices," end quote. Calling on Brazil to follow the lead of Wilberforce and Buxton, José Bonifacio's words approached the violence of a garrison. Quote, "Riches and more riches do our pseudo-statesmen cry out, and their call is re-echoed by the buyers and sellers of human flesh, by our ecclesiastical bloodhounds, by our magistrates." End quote. His proposals included the abolition of the African trade, the creation of special councils for the protection of bondsmen, the encouragement of marriage and religious instruction, and the transfer to a new master of any slave who could prove he had been the victim of cruelty or injustice. While we have been told that these moderate provisions were always characteristic of Brazilian slavery, they received no hearing after the General Constitution Assembly was dissolved, and José Bonifacio was arrested and banished. His proposal that the sale of slaves be registered so that a price could be fixed for the eventual purchase of freedom was not guaranteed by statute until 1871, although judges in some areas often enforced such a rule. Okay, I am going to pause for just a second. We're on page 242. And where did we start? Sorry, I forgot. 223, I think. Yeah, 223. And we're going to 260. So, no, 260, 261, 261, yeah, 261. So, third, so I was totally wrong. Um, I am still going to take a break, though. Because we are 20 pages into it. So we're on the downhill slide, but I'm going to take a quick break. Where were we here? Enforce such a rule. There we are. Okay, so we're right there. I am going to take a quick break, let my voice settle down for a few minutes, my throat, because this reading out loud you wouldn't think would be that bad, but it does get to me. So anyway, I will be back in just a few minutes, and we will continue this chapter. All right, are we ready to get back to it? Yes, I am. Are you? I bet you are. Y'all are being silent tonight. Of course, at the moment it tells me I only got one person watching me. That's okay. I know a lot of people prefer to watch later so they can listen to a multiple in a row, um, kind of like an audiobook or something. All right. So, getting back to it. In conclusion, it would appear that the image of the warmly human big house must be balanced by a counter-image of the brutal society of the coffee barons, who even in the 1870s and 1880s governed a world in which there were no gradations between slavery and freedom. In their deep-rooted racial prejudice, their military-like discipline, their bitter resistance to any restrictions on a slave owner's will, their constant fear of insurrection, and their hostility toward meaningful religious instruction of their Negroes, these planters were hardly superior to their brothers in Mississippi. Even with the approach of inevitable emancipation, they made no effort to prepare their slaves for freedom. It was in the face of this slave, quote unquote, slave power that the Brazilian abolitionists resorted to the familiar demands for immediate and unconditional emancipation and modeled themselves on the champions of British and American reform. Joaquim Nabuco, the great leader of the Brazilian anti-slavery movement, adopted the pen name of Garrison. With the exception of legal barriers to manumission, which we shall discuss in the next chapter, the salient traits of North American slavery were to be found among the Spanish and Portuguese. Notwithstanding variations within every colony as a result of environment, economic conditions, social institutions, and the personality of owners, the Negro was everywhere a mobile and transferable possession whose labor and well-being were controlled by another man. Any comparison of slavery in North and South America should take account of the fact that Brazil alone had an area and variety comparable to all British America, and that the privileged artisans, porters, and domestic servants of colonial Brazilian cities can be compared only with their counterparts in New York and Philadelphia. Similarly, conditions in 19th century Alabama and Mississippi must be held against those in the interior coffee growing areas of the south central Brazil. Given the lack of detailed statistical information, we can only conclude that the subject is too complex and the evidence too contradictory for us to assume that the treatment of slaves was substantially better in Latin America than in British colonies, taken as a whole. The slave trade itself was a powerful agent of acculturation, one might almost say of Americanization, which tended to blur distinctions in custom and give a more uniform character to Negro slavery than would have been found among earlier forms of British serfdom and villanage. With the acquisition of important Caribbean islands by Holland, Britain, and France, and with the development of sugar planting in the 1640s, the mounting demand for slaves made it impossible for mercantilist governments to prevent the growth of a vast system of smuggling and illicit trade. The same slave ships brought cargoes to mainland and island colonies and competed with one another in supplying the Spanish. Planters of various nationalities bought slaves at reduced prices at the great Dutch entrepots at St. Eustatius and Curacao. From their forts on the African coast to their colonies in America, the Dutch, French, English, Danes, and Portuguese were thrown together in a common enterprise that doubtless produced some blending of customs and attitudes toward the Negro slave. Barbadians not only studied and imitated Brazilian methods of sugar cultivation, but possessed slaves by the 1650s who knew the language and customs of Brazil. In Guadeloupe and Martinique, Dutch émigrés from Brazil introduced the Portuguese practice of allowing slaves to grow their own provisions. During the 17th century, there were close ties between Barbados and the main colonies of North America, and many of the Negroes in the continental colonies had lived for a time in the West Indies. Some of them spoke French, Dutch, or Spanish. And that's what I was saying earlier. 400,000 were brought directly from Africa into North America, but then they were being brought first into the West Indies and then up into America, and that's where he was getting his larger number. I think it was 1.5 million, if I remember right. Anyway, much is yet to be learned about the process of cultural exchange and its possible influence on the evolution of systems of slavery in the various colonies. Few questions in American history have been so controversial or so charged with moral significance as the origin of chattel slavery and its relation to racial prejudice. The most convincing recent studies suggest that the mainland colonists adopted from Barbados the view that Negroes were especially suited for perpetual slavery, and that while the early status of some Negroes was close to that of white servants, an increasingly degraded position was both a source and result of racial prejudice. But, however unfamiliar perpetual servitude may have been to most Elizabethan Englishmen, as early as 1617, a noted Puritan writer could assume that Slavish servants were, quote unquote, Slavish servants were, quote, perpetually put under the power of the master as blackamoors with us, end quote. The problem is considerably complicated by the ambiguity of 17th century terms. Some historians have assumed that a servant was not a slave, and yet Samuel Purchas and Thomas Hobbes, to mention only two writers of that century, used the word servant to refer to the most absolute slaves. In the French and Spanish colonies, as well as in the English, the word for Negro was frequently used as a synonym for slave. But Richard Ligon considered the condition of white servants in Barbados worse than that of the Negroes. Although white men were not subject to perpetual and inheritable servitude, it would be a mistake to think they were free from all burden of slavery. In many colonies, white servants could be sold, inherited, wagered, and recovered for a debt. Gabriel Towerson, an eminent English divine, complained that too many servants confused service with a profession and thought they needed to obey only when assigned a specific task. There were two historical circumstances, however, which differentiated the white from the Negro servant. As Oscar and Mary Handlin have observed, the emigration of white laborers was in large part voluntary, and the demand for their services was great enough to induce colonial legislators to offer them various protections and rewards. This was not only true on the mainland, but also in the West Indies, where there was the additional incentive of increasing public safety and avoiding a rebellious union of Negroes and lowly whites. We should also remember that white servitude was based on the customs and laws of particular countries. The English servant was not ordinarily an article of international commerce, nor was he subject to the ancient laws of slavery as incorporated in the Jus Gentium. Yet it was a general belief that Christianity permitted the enslavement of men, quote unquote, of infidel origin, and that Negroes purchased on the African coast had either been convicted of crime or captured, hopefully in a just war, and were therefore slaves by virtue of the law of nations. Hence, Sir Edward Coke could affirm in Calvin's case, which looks like a title, Calvin's case, that infidels could either be put to death or enslaved, and Cotton Mather, doubtless drawing on Aristotle, could tell Massachusetts Negroes that they were, quote, the animate, separate, active instruments of other men, end quote. Even if colonists were inclined to apply ancient concepts of slavery to the Negro, there was nothing, of course, to prevent individual masters from evolving their own rules and practices, first in Barbados and the Leeward Islands, then in Virginia and Maryland, and finally in Pennsylvania, New York, New England, and French Canada. Societies accepted the perpetual slavery of Indians and Negroes without specific legislative sanction. In some areas, the actual statues of Negroes differed little from that of white status. In some areas, the actual status of Negroes differed little from that of white servants. In New England, where the Confederation of 1643 recognized the slavery of captives, bondsmen were considered for a time to be under the protective regulations of the Old Testament. But the fact that stands out from all the variations in temporary custom is the cumulative debasement of the Negro in every British and French colony. Whether he served the Puritans of Old Providence Island, or the French of Martinique, the Jamaican overseer, or the Virginia farmer, the Pennsylvania Quaker, or the Canadian convent, his person was the property of his owner, and he and his progeny, if they were born of a slave woman, were condemned to eternal bondage. From 1680 to 1710, virtually every English and French colony from the St. Lawrence to South America acquired laws that attempted to define the slave's peculiar position as conveyable property, subject to rules respecting debt, descent, and taxation, and as a man who might be protected, punished, or prevented from exercising human capacities. Given the wide range of differences in colonial societies, the surprising fact about these laws is their underlying similarity. Everywhere they embodied ambiguities and compromises that arose from the impossibility of acting consistently on the premise that men were things. The basic contradiction was elucidated much later by a Virginia court which echoed the doctrine of Seneca. Quote, slaves are not only property, but they are rational beings, and entitled to the humanity of the court, when it can be exercised without invading the rights of property, and as regards the owner, their value is much enhanced by the mutual attachment of master and slave, a value which cannot enter into the calculation of damages by a jury. End quote. Both French and English colonial law assumed that the slave had essentially the attributes of personal property, and, like a horse or cow, could be moved, sold, or rented out at the will of his owner. In several colonies, however, there was doubt whether, for purposes of taxation, slaves should be rated as persons, personal property, or real estate. And while no colony presumed to infringe upon the slaveholder's right to move or sell his property, it was widely recognized that, in the interests of both the slave and society, there should be special rules regarding debt and inheritance. As early as the 1660s, planters in the Leeward Islands were disturbed by the fact that merchant creditors could force the sale of Negroes and other chattels at auction, and thus deprive an estate of its productive capacity. In addition, the death of a planter sometimes resulted in the ruin of his estate when executors or minor heirs needlessly disposed of slaves. To prevent these evils, colonial legislators tried to invest bondsmen with some of the attributes of real estate, and thus provided lawyers with a subject for endless debate and confused litigation. In 1669, an Antigua law ruled that if a debtor's chattels, including white servants, were insufficient to satisfy a claim, the creditor must accept slaves as, quote, estates of inheritance, end quote, attached to the freehold and assume management of the plantation. In the previous year, Barbados had defined slaves as freehold property, although in 1672 they were deemed chattels for the payment of an owner's debts. For more than a century, legislators in Jamaica and the Leeward Islands sought to make the descent of slaves conform to the law for freehold property and to prevent Negroes from being seized for debt when claims could be satisfied by their means. But in all other respects, as a Nevis Statute of 1705 made clear, there was no question that slaves were chattels. The French islands, Virginia, and South Carolina all experienced the same difficulties in trying to reconcile the notion of a slave as personal property with the desire to protect the integrity of the estates. Under the Code Noir, the slave was unmistakably a chattel. But a royal decree of 1721 prohibited heirs under the age of 25 from selling slaves from their estates. After 1705, bondsmen in Virginia were accounted real estate for purpose of descent, but chattels by an act of 1727 with respect to gifts and devices. 3 years later, a court decided that regardless of previous statutes, executors were to consider slave property as no different from horses or cattle, a view which the Assembly endorsed in 1748, when it was decided that confusion could be lessened by reducing bondsmen to their quote-unquote natural condition as personal goods. This new law was nullified, however, by the Crown. There is evidence that Negroes in Virginia were sometimes annexed to the land and entailed, and were considered by courts as in some sense bound to the soil in inheritance. But in 1794 it was held in Walden v. Payne that though the law had protected bondsmen from unnecessary sale for the payment of debts and levies, they were chattels by nature. We might note that the confusion was carried across the mountains into Kentucky, which adopted the Virginia law of 1705, defining slaves as real estate for certain purposes. In colonial South Carolina, bondsmen were regarded as chattels personal, notwithstanding an attempt in 1690 to class them as real estate, and yet as late as 1837 a court upheld an action of trespass against the captain of a patrol who had whipped a slave belonging to the plaintiff, but hired out to another man, on the ground that a slave was more analogous to land than to personal property. In addition to appealing to the analogy of an easement, the court maintained that a master possessed all the legal means of protecting his slave that the slave himself would have, had he been a free man. It is not quite accurate, then, to think of chattel slavery as a well-defined status which put the Negro on precisely the same footing as other personal property. In no American colony was he attached to the soil in the sense of the colonist, or in a way that limited the freedom of his owner, but for both economic and humanitarian reasons, judges and lawmakers recognized that the slave was something more than a private and expendable possession. The ambiguity was more pronounced when it came to regulating the bondsman's daily life and defining his relations with other people. If we think of freedom as a power to act or cause others to act, then it is clear that even the most authoritarian master, supported by the most oppressive laws, was to some extent limited by the will of his slaves, who had the power to appeal, flatter, humiliate, disobey, sabotage, or rebel. Richard Ligon reported that Barbadian Negroes not only persuaded planters to improve their diet, but complained so long about the shortage of women that their owners felt obliged to purchase more. The coveted females became apportioned by the slaves themselves in accordance with their own social hierarchies. Courts and legislatures were further removed from the direct influence of slaves and had, besides, the mission of maintaining the standards and morale of slave owners. Yet in few instances could the law ignore the human capacities of slaves. We have already seen that there were formidable obstacles to the religious conversion of slaves. By and large, Catholics showed far more concern for the souls of Negroes than did Protestants, and yet a number of British colonies, including New York, Jamaica, and South Carolina, gave official encouragement to such missionary work. If this amounted to little more than pious lip service, the same could be said of the religious provisions in the Code Noir. The Spanish and Portuguese were more successful in winning converts, but it is doubtful whether the mass of slaves in any colony enjoyed a meaningful religious life. At least at this point, that's what they're saying, but in most depictions we've seen in our own media in the past 100 years, all the Negro slaves were super religious, super Christian. I mean, just which I don't know. Is that wishful thinking? Is that projection? Is it like they were saying, well, like he said earlier, where it was exaggeration? I don't know, but and we're not at the right time period yet. But like for example, in the movie, oh shit, now I've forgotten the name of it. Glory with Matthew Broderick, and yes, I know I named the white guy first, um, but it had Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington and a fantastic, fantastic crew cast. They depicted all of the black soldiers, who most of them had been former slaves, or all of them had been former slaves, as being super, super Christian, religious Christians. I mean, singing praises constantly. And I mean, so was that just an exaggeration of the author of that story? Because so far it's sounding like they weren't easy to convert. So I'm not sure. But then again, we're not up to the Civil War era. All right, moving on. Whether a Negro worked on Sunday or had an opportunity to marry were largely matters of local custom and circumstance. An article in the Code Noir forbidding Sunday work was apparently no better enforced than similar laws in colonial Georgia and South Carolina, but in many British colonies it was customary to reserve Sundays for leisure and marketing, and to grant days of respite at Christmas, Easter, and Whitsuntide. I'm not familiar with Whitsuntide. That term, anyway. I'll have to look that one up. Since even Pennsylvania prohibited the marriage of white servants without their master's consent, it is not surprising that this was a minimal restriction for slaves under both English and French law. A Massachusetts statute said that so long as servants were of the same nation, quote unquote nation, their marriage should not be unreasonably denied. But in French Canada, where slave marriages were legally valid when permitted by a master, infants were disposed of at the will of the mother's owner, and when they died were listed only as the property of a master, with no indication of their parentage. In the British West Indies and southern mainland colonies, slave marriages were no more legal than under Roman law, but as in Roman law, 19th century Louisiana courts acknowledged that such a Tubercantabernum had legal consequences and could become valid as a contract after manumission. In 1871, a judge of the Supreme Court of Tennessee delivered the opinion that slave marriages had always been valid in that state, though not followed by all the legal consequences of a marriage between free men. This somewhat questionable view simply underlines the essential point. It was impossible to ignore the fact that slaves could and did marry, but even where given legal sanction, such marriages were radically altered by the effects of bondage. The capacity to marry was closely related to the capacity to make contracts, own property, and hold offices or commissions, all of which were specifically denied by the Code Noir. As early as 1623, Bermuda prohibited Negroes from exchanging goods for tobacco without consent of their owners, and within a century, British colonies from Connecticut to Barbados had evolved an elaborate system of police regulations which required Negroes to have a pass or ticket signed by their masters for the buying or selling of goods. These measures, which were designed to curtail theft, were a tacit admission that a slave might act as his master's agent. There is substantial evidence that bondsmen in the English colonies were often permitted to own horses, mules, and cattle, and to trade in a variety of merchandise. Moreover, in the 19th century, some courts and legislative bodies were inclined to accept the fact that a slave, although a chattel, is also a person and, to some extent, capable of acquisition of property. Okay, what the hell is going on here? Something just changed for no reason, but we seem to be all good. Okay, I don't know why. It just minimized my Twitch software and brought something else up for no reason. All right, where was I? 19th century, some courts and kind of the fact that a slave, although a chattel, is also a person, and to some extent capable of acquisition of property for the benefit of the master. End quote. This meant that when he acted, for example, as a purchasing agent for his master, the latter might be held liable for any debts incurred. But though courts often acknowledged that slaves might acquire and hold personal property, at law such property vested with the master. This was a principle, as we have seen, which appeared in Spanish law from Las Siete Partidas to the Code of 1785 from Santo Domingo. Men who thought the evils of slavery could be gradually abolished by humane laws were much impressed by the fact that the Code Noir and the Real Cedula, whatever, set minimum standards for food. Yet a leading authority on French slavery concluded that the regulations regarding food, clothing, and care of the sick and aged had been largely ineffective. This judgment was confirmed by Pierre Charlevoix, who in the 1720s saw slaves in Saint-Domingue living on roots, dwelling in what seemed like bear cages, and being driven by the lash to almost unceasing work. A royal ordinance of 1786 raised and extended the minimal standards of welfare, anticipating in some respects the Real Cedula. But in a few years the French colonies were racked by war and revolution, and it is questionable whether the provisions were ever seriously enforced. While Jamaican law set standards for slave food and clothing, and by 1792 required masters to support disabled slaves, one may doubt Brian Edwards' picture of a kind of welfare state where, quote-unquote, many bondsmen lived in large houses with boarded floors, slept on linen sheets, and ate off Staffordshire ware. As early as 1740, South Carolina law decreed that owners must supply slaves with sufficient food and clothing, but there is no evidence that enforcement was any more effective than in Jamaica or Saint Domingue. Even when a slave had suffered from famine and frostbite, a South Carolina court found it necessary to justify its authority. Quote, instances do sometimes, though rarely, occur in which it is necessary to interfere in behalf of the slave against the avarice of the master. End quote. Of all colonizing peoples, the British were undoubtedly the most jealous of the rights of private property and the least inclined to welcome the state's intervention in the management of slaves. But we must qualify this generalization by emphasizing that the principle of intervention was accepted by courts in the British colonies and the United States, and that even more authoritarian governments were generally unsuccessful in their efforts to promote the welfare of slaves. No aspect of American slavery was more disturbing to men's consciences than the Negro's lack of protection from murder and physical assault. In 1683, 2 years before French Negroes were given some physical security by the Code Noir, the English Committee for Trade and Plantations strongly objected to a Jamaican law that would have punished the willful killing of a slave with only a fine. For many decades, Britain brought pressure on colonial governments to enact stricter penalties for crimes against the persons of slaves. In a few colonies, such as Pennsylvania, there were no forces to check the public's sense of justice, and slaves enjoyed many of the legal protections of freemen. But the legislators of Antigua gave voice to the fear that was dominant wherever the proportion of Negroes was large. Admitting that the killing and mutilation of human beings was contrary to the laws of God, they also observed that it would be dangerous, quote, to set slaves so far upon an equality with the free inhabitants as to try those that kill them for their lives. End quote. In the British West Indies, even the most wanton murder of a bondsman was long thought to deserve but a small fine. For a time, the laws of Virginia refused to admit that such an act could be a crime. Nevertheless, both on the mainland and in the Caribbean, 18th century legislators gradually stiffened the penalty for killing a slave and sometimes provided rewards for informers. Except in a few recalcitrant colonies such as Barbados, American lawmaking bodies were willing by the early 19th century to enact statutes that made the willful killing of a slave a felony punishable by death. As early as 1791, North Carolina was ready to call the crime murder. By 1816, the law of Georgia held that the killing or maiming of a slave was on the same level of criminality as the killing or maiming of a white man. Under abolitionist pressure, Jamaica went so far as to make the rape of a slave woman punishable by death. More significant than a gradual hardening of penalties was a view endorsed by a committee of the Jamaican Assembly at a time when the islanders were first being stung by abolitionist attacks. The committee held that slaves had always been under the protection of the common law except where it was limited for the public good by definite statutes. This doctrine would seem to imply that so far as criminal law was concerned, the rights of slave and freemen were roughly the same, and that the status of slavery involved only limited and express disabilities which had been imposed by specific legislation. While such a view would appear to run counter to all conceptions of chattel slavery, it won the acceptance of certain American judges. In 1823, the highest court of North Carolina ruled that an indictment for murder or for unprovoked battery on a slave was sufficient under the common law. Later on, courts in the same state said that a bondsman had the right to resist or to escape from cruel or excessive assaults, and that even the insolence of a slave could not justify a felonious attack upon his person. One such decision brought a bitter dissent on the ground that Negroes, being an inferior race, were insensitive to the provocation of assault, but in general this view did not win judicial support. The doctrine of the Jamaican Assembly Committee appeared somewhat negatively in a Virginia decision of 1827, which ruled that specific statutes prevented the jurisdiction of common law from extending so far as to protect slaves against minor injuries at the hands of their owners. But this verdict aroused a vigorous dissenting opinion which maintained that until 1669 slaves had been protected by common law, and that since later ferocious and sanguinary statutes had been repealed in 1788, the common law had been revived in all its force. The assumption seemed to underlie the decision in Souther versus Commonwealth, 1851, in which the court said that a master might punish his slave to ensure obedience, but that he did so at his own peril, for if death ensued, the principles of common law relating to homicide applied without qualification or exception. In this particular case, the master was deemed guilty of murder. But one reason why planters were gradually willing to accept more stringent laws protecting their slaves can be seen in the admission of Bryan Edwards, the Jamaican pro-slavery apologist, who noted that the great and quote-unquote incurable defect of the system was that the testimony of slaves could never be accepted against white men, even in cases of the most atrocious injury. Hence, when a judge in Virginia made an appeal to his colleagues on the bench, asking them to extend protections of the common law to slaves, it was with the reassurance that there could be no danger so long as courts and juries were composed of men who owned slaves. Under the Code Noir, slaves had the privilege of appealing to the Attorney General, who might act as their legal agent. But as Elsa V. Govea has observed, the Attorney General was more preoccupied with prosecuting slaves than with protecting them, and there is apparently no record of a French master being executed for killing a slave. In Grenada and other British colonies, Negroes had a similar right to report grievances to a guardian or justice of the peace, but since these men were largely sympathetic to slaveholders, and since the slaves themselves could not give evidence, the meanest planter had little to fear. It was common for courts to admit the testimony of one slave against another in criminal cases, but this was usually to a master's advantage. It not only furnished intelligence of plots and insurrections, but served to keep Negroes suspicious of one another. Okay, we're getting there. We're on 258 out of 261. Whew. Still a long chapter, even if it's not as long as I was thinking it. Even in colonial Pennsylvania, slaves were denied a jury trial and were relegated to special courts which lacked the procedural protections guaranteed to freemen. In the Leeward Islands, during most of the 18th century, a Negro might be condemned to death or dismemberment at the discretion of any two justices. The most advanced position was that taken by Georgia and North Carolina, both of which granted slaves the right to jury trial. In 1816, the latter state extended their procedural rights so that a bondsman might, through the agency of his owner, make peremptory challenges of jurors. But while slaveholders in both the West Indies and the Southern states showed increasing inclination after the 1780s to soften the barbarous codes of the past and to provide Negroes with a somewhat fairer mode of trial, they stood firm in refusing to place in the bondsman's hands the full power of the law. Sorry, itchy eyes here. To do so, they they felt would subvert the very foundations of their authority, and yet it was impossible at times to deny the legal capacities of the slave. As a South Carolina justice explained in 1845, quote, "The words of a Negro are at least as significant as the cry of a brute animal, and if any sound whatever contemptuous with an act might serve to give meaning to the act, it would be admissible." So while they were thought of as stupid brutes, even a stupid brute animal can protest at being abused. That was the thinking. Okay. It is a curious fact that both abolitionists and apologists for slavery argued that the existing laws were meaningless. The former contended that the slaves' legal protections were mere window dressing, which was largely true, and slaveholders replied that the worst features of the law of bondage were mere vestiges of a barbarous era when men had not learned that slavery and benevolence were compatible. According to Edward Long, the sanguinary slave codes of Jamaica had been borrowed from Barbados, which in turn had copied the savage laws of England regarding villeins and seamen. In no case had they been vigorously enforced. According to patriotic Americans, slavery was a creation of British avarice and intrigue, and the most shocking laws were either anachronisms or should be interpreted as security measures which had never been intended to be enforced. Hence it was unjust for zealous critics to use these ancient or forgotten statutes as evidence that Negroes were still being mutilated or burned alive at the whim of any justice of the peace. In both the West Indies and the American South, apologists could quite plausibly point to a steady growth in the slave's substantive and procedural rights, and conclude that slavery, like any other institution, was subject to the inexorable laws of human progress. We should not dismiss these efforts of slaveholders at self-reform as sheer hypocrisy and propaganda. There can be no doubt that enlightened men in Jamaica and Antigua, as well as in Virginia and South Carolina, were often deeply disturbed by the grosser defects and injustices of slavery. In the 1780s, for example, Jamaica made a concerted effort to repeal sanguinary laws and to enact a code which would at once be more in conformity with actual conditions and serve as a minimal standard for the less charitable managers. Edward Long, who had no admiration for the Negro and who stoutly opposed the abolition of the African trade, was nevertheless in favor of promoting the health and welfare of slaves, of lightening their punishments, of preserving the integrity of their families, and of taking steps to attach them to the soil. As early as 1740, South Carolina lawmakers condemned cruelty to slaves as, quote, "odious in the eyes of all men who have any sense of virtue or humanity." End quote. Yet even if one conceded that reform was possible, there were formidable problems of jurisdiction, inspection, and enforcement. The Code Noir, which failed to provide adequate measures for inspection and enforcement, could at least be repealed or modified by the central government that drafted it. After the British government had once consented to colonial laws, its powers were considerably more limited. In the 1670s, there was some feeling in Britain that the interests of the nation and the Royal African Company would be advanced by a more centralized administration of colonial slavery. It was pointed out that the only way to prevent smuggling or an eventual rebellion of Negroes would be to require a uniform branding and registry of British slaves, administered by a major general who would be independent of the planters and colonial governments. Last page. There was not the slightest trace of anti-slavery feeling in this proposal, but if it had been put into effect, the later task of British abolitionists would have been infinitely easier. As it was, Britain could not rely on an established system of courts and administrators independent of slaveholder influence, and the American Revolution not only removed the largest portion of slaves from the jurisdiction of the British Crown and Parliament, but vindicated principles which sanctioned the right of all slaveholders to self-government. There is no evidence that the irrevocable forces of history worked to guide American slavery gently and peacefully toward ascending phases of serfdom and liberty. If the institution was sometimes eroded by economic change or by the necessities of war, there is no reason to think that the Negro's position was improved by a gold rush in Minas Gerais, by an expansion of Brazilian coffee plantations, or by a development of new lands in Jamaica, Trinidad, or Mississippi. And yet in no country was it possible to ignore the bondsman's essential humanity, or to deny him, however inconsistently with the law, certain rights and privileges. Everywhere the more thoughtful masters had cautious hopes of augmenting these rights and privileges until, by some miracle of evolution, the obvious evils of slavery could wither away and the grateful Negro would willingly give his service without coercion. But all such dreams and hopes ran aground on the simple and solid fact which for centuries had been obscured by philosophy and law, that a slave was not a piece of property, nor a half-human instrument, but a man held down by force. And that is the end of chapter 8. It was a long one, but we made it through. The next one is chapter 9, the continuing contradiction of slavery, emancipation, intermixture, and prejudice. Starts on 262 and goes through 288, which ends part 2 of the book and starts us into part 3. So 262 to 288. So we've got 26 pages. Yeah, 26 pages for the next one. So it's rather short compared to tonight's, which was just shy of 40 pages. So, yeah, we will pick that up on Tuesday. And I hope you're enjoying it. I am. Been very informative. Hello. How are you tonight? It's been a great read. If you've missed out on the earlier chapters, the first couple are up on. Well, no, I think almost all of them, but this one are up on the YouTube channel. So if you want to catch up, they are there. In fact, let's see. I'm pretty sure I've got, well, let's see. Okay. Everything through chapter 6 should already be up on the YouTube channel. So, and it's under the same name, Meneth Gilgalad. So, just check it out there. Every reading I've done is there under the occult readings list. And so far, this is the 5th book I've read, I think. I was just going through those tonight. I started out with Forbidden History, and then I read The Temple and the Lodge, Then I read, which on the Masons. Then somewhere in there I read 1984. I read Forbidden Religion. Um, and then I read one about the Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals was the name of it. Didn't really have much to do one with the other, but yeah, check them out. They're all there. This was our 86th reading in I'm still calling it occult, even though I haven't really done anything truly occult yet. But I will be. I have tons of stuff in the works. But yeah, we keep plugging away at it. I've got thousands of books to read on this stream. So um, anyway, that's it for this one. I am going to that I hadn't done. You were thinking that I hadn't done anything occult. Yeah. Well, I keep letting people vote on what I read, and they keep picking this other stuff. I mean, and if you get into the Templars and the Masons, okay, you're kind of into occult stuff a little bit, but we really haven't dived into anything truly occult. So that's coming up. Yeah, absolutely. And I intend to read more of this guy's books. This is David Bryan Davis, if you've never heard of him. He wrote 4 or 5 books on slavery in Western culture. I have another one right here. I'm not going to read it next. I'm going to take a break from this stuff, but this is in the age of emancipation. So we'll eventually get to that one. But I was actually thinking of reading something next, like the secret architecture of our nation's capital, but that's going to be getting back into Freemasonry. Um, I've even thought about reading stuff like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene on here. Um, I'll be here for the long run, so this is interesting, but also looking forward to the occult one day. Yeah, absolutely. So I usually do a what's it called, a poll on Twitter when I'm getting close to the end of a book. I'm on Twitter under the same name, Meneth Gilgalad. I'm pretty much Meneth Gilgalad everywhere. Um, so if you go there, um, I have people that go to Twitter just to follow my polls. They don't use Twitter otherwise. So if you don't use it and you want to go there and subscribe and look out for those, you get to vote on the book that I'm going to read next. Um, although the next one I might just decide on my own, so it doesn't, uh, so people don't vote on something like this again right off the bat. But anyway, um, that'll be that. I am going to end this session and take a little bit of a break, and then I'll be back to play some Mass Effect 3, which I just started Friday. Never played all the way through it. So, yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. But I will see you there if you stick around. If not, have a good night.